The air on the 64th floor of Sterling & Co. didn't smell like pine needles or cinnamon. It smelled of expensive cologne, ozone from 100 humming servers, and the cold, metallic scent of high-stakes ambition. In this office, Christmas was not a holiday. It was a fiscal quarter with festive dressing. Clara sat at her desk, her shoulders hunched. She was an analyst, a worker bee in a hive of hornets. Around her, the office was a blur of activity. Men in three-piece suits that cost more than her car were barking into headsets, while assistants scurried with stacks of documents that decided the fate of global shipping lanes. The Secret Santa announcement had arrived via a formal gold-embossed email from Human Resources. In any other company, it was a bit of fun. At Sterling & Co., it was a calculated maneuver. People used it to bribe their superiors or to mock their rivals. When the HR director, a woman who smiled like a shark, walked around with the velvet bag of names, Clara's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached in, her fingers brushing against several slips of paper before settling on one. She pulled it out, shielding it from the prying eyes of Sarah, the girl at the next cubicle, who was already bragging about drawing the head of marketing. Clara unfolded the paper. Two words were printed in crisp black ink: Julian Vane. The world seemed to tilt. Julian Vane. The man was a myth draped in charcoal wool. He didn't just run the company, he owned the very ground it stood on. He was a billionaire several times over, a man who had branches of his empire in London, Tokyo, and Dubai. But more than his wealth, it was his presence that terrified people. He was the Iron Vault. He spoke only when necessary, and his silence was said to be more expensive than most people's careers. Clara looked at her reflection in her darkened computer screen. She was 24, her bank account was hovering in the low hundreds, and she had just been tasked with buying a gift for a man who could buy the moon if he found the night too dark. Inside the glass-walled sanctuary of the corner office, Julian Vane stood looking out at the city. The snow was beginning to dust the rooftops of Manhattan, turning the concrete jungle into something almost soft. But Julian didn't feel soft. He felt weary. He heard the chime of his private elevator. He knew his staff was preparing for the annual Christmas gala. He knew they were currently participating in the Secret Santa, and he knew, with a bitter certainty, what he would receive. Last year, it had been a solid gold fountain pen from an executive who wanted a promotion. The year before, a case of vintage wine from 1945 that cost $10,000. He had looked at both and felt nothing. They weren't gifts, they were transactions. Who has my name this year? He wondered. He felt a flicker of a fear he would never admit aloud, the fear of being truly known. If someone gave him something expensive, it meant they feared him. If they gave him something flashy, it meant they wanted something from him. He scrolled through the employee directory on his tablet, his eyes stopping on a photo of a young woman with bright, intelligent eyes and a messy bun. Clara. He had seen her in the break room once, reading a book on architectural history instead of scrolling through the stock market feed like everyone else. For a fleeting second, he hoped it was her, but then he dismissed the thought. She would probably just give him a Starbucks gift card or a generic tie out of sheer terror. And who could blame her? He had spent 15 years making sure people were terrified of him. It was safer that way. Clara didn't go to the mall. She knew that any store she could afford would hold nothing Julian Vane would value. She spent her lunch breaks in the basement archives of the city library, digging through old microfilms of business journals from the late 90s. She wasn't looking for his net worth, she was looking for his why. She found it in a dusty, digitized copy of a regional Swiss newspaper, a tiny blurb about a young Julian Vane, a student who had won a scholarship. The article mentioned his late grandfather, a man named Emile, who had been a master clockmaker in a village so small it wasn't on most maps. My grandfather taught me that time is the only currency that matters because you can never earn more of it, a 20-year-old Julian had told the reporter. Clara sat back. The blue light of the library computer illuminated her face. A clock. No, he had the best clocks in the world. He had a Patek Philippe on his wrist that cost as much as a house. He didn't need a clock. He needed a place for his time to rest. She went to a local timber yard. She couldn't afford a whole slab of walnut, but the owner, seeing the desperation and spark in her eyes, pointed her to a scrap bin of high-grade black walnut and aromatic cedar. "What are you making, kid?" the man asked. "A memory," Clara whispered. For the next 2 weeks, Clara's life became a secret mission. By day, she processed mergers and acquisitions, her eyes bleary from lack of sleep. By night, she sat at her kitchen table, which she had covered in old newspapers. She didn't have fancy power tools. She had a set of Japanese carving chisels she'd bought at a pawn shop and sandpaper ranging from grit so coarse it drew blood to grit so fine it felt like silk. She began to carve. She wasn't just making a watch stand, she was sculpting a landscape. Into the base of the dark walnut, she used a magnifying glass and a needle-thin blade to etch the skyline of that tiny Swiss village. She carved the tiny steeple of the church, the jagged peaks of the Alps, and the small cottage where Emile Vane once worked. Her fingers cramped. She accidentally sliced her thumb, requiring a bandage that she had to hide under her sleeves at work. She felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She wasn't just an analyst anymore. She was a creator. She found herself thinking about Julian as she worked. She wondered if he ever felt the grain of wood under his hands. She wondered if he ever felt the cold of the mountain air. She began to feel a strange, protective pull towards him. He wasn't just a boss, he was a grandson who had lost his way in a forest of gold. Julian noticed her. It was impossible not to. In the high-speed environment of Sterling & Co., Clara was the only one who seemed to be slowing down. He saw the bandages on her fingers. He saw the way she looked at him in the elevator, not with the usual predatory ambition, but with a look of profound, quiet empathy. It unnerved him. One Tuesday, he intentionally stayed late, lurking in the shadows of his office as she finished her shift. He watched her pack her bag. She handled a small wrapped bundle with such tenderness that he felt a pang of jealousy. Who is she making that for, he thought. A boyfriend? A father? He felt a sudden, sharp realization. He wanted someone to look at something they were giving him with that much care. He went home to his penthouse that night, surrounded by marble and glass, and for the first time in a decade, the silence of his home felt deafening. He poured himself a drink, sat in the dark, and looked at his $100,000 watch. It told him exactly what time it was, but it didn't tell him why it mattered. The night of the Christmas party arrived. The ballroom was draped in silver and blue. A jazz band played smooth, expensive versions of carols. Clara stood by the gift table. Her heart was a drum. Her gift looked pathetic. It was wrapped in brown butcher paper she had recycled from a grocery bag, tied with a simple piece of twine. Beside it sat a gift wrapped in velvet with a diamond-encrusted bow. "Is that yours?" Sarah asked, pointing at the brown package and giggling. "Who did you get? The janitor?" "It's for my match," Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. Across the room, Julian entered. The music seemed to dip in volume as he walked. He wore a tuxedo that fit him like armor. His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Clara. She looked small, pale, and incredibly brave. The Secret Santa reveal began. It was a spectacle of greed. People opened iPads, designer bags, and keys to sports cars. The room was a roar of "thank yous" that sounded like lies. Then the HR director, a woman who smiled like a shark, picked up the brown paper package. "For Mr. Vane," she said, her voice wavering. The room went silent. A few people snickered. Someone whispered, "Oh, someone's getting fired tomorrow." Julian stepped forward. He took the small, heavy box. He felt the rough texture of the paper. He looked at Clara. She was staring at her shoes, her face flushed deep red. He tore the paper. The scent of cedar hit him first, sharp, clean, and nostalgic. Then he saw the wood. He didn't speak, he didn't move. He ran his thumb over the base of the dark walnut, feeling the tiny microscopic ridges of the Swiss church steeple. He recognized the mountains. He recognized the shape of the cottage. The room was waiting for the explosion. The VP stepped forward, ready to apologize for the insult of such a cheap gift. But Julian Vane didn't explode. He sat down, right there in the middle of the gala, on a folding chair. He sat and stared at the piece of wood. A single tear, just one, traveled down the cheek of the most powerful man in the state. "Where did you find this
Wood?" he asked, his voice a ghost of a sound. Clara stepped forward, her voice shaking. "It's walnut, sir, from a scrap heap. I carved it myself. I thought you might need a place to put your watch, so you could stop looking at it for a while." Julian looked up. For the first time, he didn't look like a titan. He looked like a man who had finally been found. "You didn't buy this," he whispered. "You gave me your time." The silence following Julian's words was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The high-ranking executives swapped confused glances, their expensive silk ties suddenly feeling a bit too tight. They had prepared speeches and calculated tributes, but they had no script for a CEO who was moved to tears by a block of scrap wood. Julian stood up slowly. He didn't put the gift back on the table. He tucked it under his arm, shielding it as if it were a fragile bird. "The party is over for me," he announced, his voice regaining its granite edge, though his eyes remained fixed on Clara. "The rest of you, please, enjoy the champagne. You paid enough for it." As Julian walked toward the elevators, the crowd began to buzz like a disturbed hive. Clara felt a hand on her arm. It was Sarah, her face a mask of shock. "What was that? Clara, what did you do?" "I just gave him a gift," Clara whispered, her knees finally giving out. She sank into a nearby chair, her heart still performing a frantic solo in her chest. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt exposed. She had reached into the most private part of a powerful man's history and pulled it into the light. She wondered if, by morning, he would regret letting her see him so vulnerable. The next morning, the office felt different. The Secret Santa incident was the only topic of conversation. Rumors flew. Clara was a secret relative. Clara was an expert in psychological manipulation. Clara was being fired at noon. Clara kept her head down, staring at a spreadsheet of logistics costs. At 10 a.m., her desk phone rang. "Clara, this is Marcus, Mr. Vane deficient. He'd like to see you. Now." The walk to the corner office felt like a walk to the gallows. When she entered, Julian wasn't behind his desk. He was sitting at a small round table near the window. The wooden watch stand was there, and resting upon it was his watch, a masterpiece of silver and sapphire. "Sit down, Clara," he said. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept, but there was a softness in his jawline she hadn't noticed before. "I spent all night looking at this. I haven't thought about that village in 20 years. I spent so long trying to get away from the poverty of my youth that I forgot the peace of it." "I didn't mean to upset you, sir," Clara said softly. "You didn't upset me. You woke me up." He leaned forward. "Tell me about the bandages. You cut yourself making this, didn't you?" Clara instinctively hid her hands under the table. It was nothing. The wood was a bit stubborn. Julian reached across the table, a gesture so personal that Clara's breath hitched, and gently took her wrist, pulling her hand into the light. He looked at the small cuts and the stained cuticles. "People usually bleed for me to make me money. No one has ever bled to make me a memory. Thank you." From that day on, the vault was no longer closed to Clara. It started at small things. Julian would stop by her cubicle, not to ask for a report, but to ask if she had read the latest editorial in the paper. The office watched in stunned silence as the most powerful man in the state stood by a low-level analyst's desk, laughing at something she whispered. The predatory atmosphere of Sterling and Co. began to shift. You couldn't bully someone who had the CEO's ear, and Clara used that power quietly, protecting the interns and suggesting better benefits for the cleaning staff. "You're a terrible corporate shark," Julian told her one evening as they walked toward the parking garage. It had become a habit. He would wait until she was finished with her work so he could walk her to the subway. "I'm not a shark at all," Clara laughed, the cold winter air turning her cheeks pink. "I'm more like a sea turtle. I just want to get to where I'm going without getting eaten." Julian stopped by his sleek black car. He looked at her, the city lights reflecting in his dark eyes. "I don't think anyone is going to eat you, Clara, not while I'm around." For a second, the air between them changed. It wasn't about the company or the gift. It was the way he looked at her, as if she were the only bright thing in a very dark world. January turned into February, and the Secret Santa bond only deepened. Julian began inviting Clara to consult on projects, but they both knew it was an excuse to spend time together. They began to see each other outside the office. It wasn't the high glamour life Clara expected. Julian didn't want to go to five-star restaurants where people stared. He wanted to go to the places Clara liked, the dusty bookstores, the tiny ramen shops, the parks where the snow stayed white for more than an hour. In these moments, Julian confessed his fears. "Everyone thinks I'm afraid of losing my money," he said one night over steaming bowls of noodles. "But I'm not. I'm afraid that if I stopped working, I'd disappear, that there's nothing left of the boy from the mountains." Clara reached across the table and touched his hand. This time, he didn't pull away. His fingers twined with hers, his grip tight and slightly trembling. "The boy from the mountains is the one who recognized the wood, Julian. He's still there. He's the best part of you." Julian looked at her, and the iron vault finally crumbled. He realized he wasn't just grateful to her, he was in love with her. But he was Julian Vane, a man with 1,000 enemies, and a life that could crush someone as gentle as Clara. "I shouldn't like you this much," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's dangerous for you. I've handled sharp chisels and rough wood, Julian. I think I can handle you."
The story of the CEO and the analyst wasn't a scandal. It was a transformation. Julian became a fair leader, and Clara became a woman who knew her worth wasn't tied to her bank account. On a particularly cold Tuesday in March, Julian brought a small box to Clara's desk. It wasn't a diamond, though he could have bought a mountain of them. Inside was a small, vintage wood carving tool, the exact model his grandfather had used. "I found it in an auction in Zurich," he said, leaning against her cubicle wall, ignoring the stares of the entire floor. "I thought maybe we could go there together, to the village. I want to show you the church tower you carved." Clara looked up at him, her heart overflowing. "I'd like that. But Julian—" "Yes? I'm still not giving you an expensive gift for your birthday." Julian laughed, a sound that rang through the sterile office like a bell. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, and for the first time, he didn't care who saw. He kissed her forehead, a promise of a future that had nothing to do with mergers and everything to do with the time they had left to spend. "You've already given me everything," he whispered. The Secret Santa of Sterling and Co. had started as a game of greed, but it had ended with the greatest merger of all, two souls who finally found a place to rest. As April's rains washed away the last of the New York slush, the atmosphere within the 64th floor reached a fever pitch of speculation. It wasn't just that Clara was frequently seen in Julian's office, it was the way the office itself was changing. The iron vault had started leaving his door open. He had replaced the aggressive modern art on his walls with framed sketches of clockwork mechanisms. Julian felt a lightness he hadn't known in decades, but with it came a terrifying vulnerability. He sat at his desk, staring at the watchstand Clara had made him. For years, his wealth had been his armor. If people feared him, they couldn't hurt him. But Clara didn't fear him. She looked at him with a clarity that stripped him bare. He found himself worrying about her safety in the Shark Tank culture he had created. He knew the VPs were whispering, calling her an opportunist. It made his blood boil, but he knew that overprotecting her would only validate their venom. Clara, meanwhile, was fighting her own internal battle. She loved the quiet moments with Julian, the way he looked when he was thinking, the way he remembered her favorite type of tea. But the weight of his world was immense. Every time she stepped into his office, she felt the eyes of 1,000 employees on her back. She didn't want to be the CEO's girlfriend. She wanted to be the woman who saw the man behind the machine. One evening, Julian invited Clara to his penthouse, not for a gala, but for a simple dinner. It was the first time she had seen where he lived. The space was cold, minimalist, and surgically clean. It looked like a museum of a life, not a home. "You live in a lightbox, Julian," she said, walking to the floor-to-ceiling window. "It's efficient," he replied, though he sounded unconvinced. "It's lonely," she corrected softly. She turned to find him standing much closer than she expected. The air between them hummed with the electricity of things left unsaid. Julian reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, before he pulled back. "I spent my whole life making sure I never needed anyone, and then you walked into a room with a block of wood and a brown paper bag, and you made me realize I've been starving in a palace." Clara took his hand and placed it against her face. "You don't have to be a titan here, Julian. You can just be the man who misses his grandfather." The peace didn't last. By May, a rival firm attempted a hostile takeover of Sterling & Co., sensing a softness in Julian's leadership. During a grueling 12-hour board meeting, the lead director, a man named Henderson, who viewed empathy as a defect, pointedly mentioned Julian's distractions. "We are concerned, Julian, that your focus has shifted from the bottom line to extracurricular interests in the junior ranks," Henderson sneered. Julian felt the old coldness rising, the urge to crush Henderson like an ant. But he looked at the watchstand sitting on the boardroom table. He had started bringing it with him to every major meeting, and he took a breath. "My focus has shifted towards building a company that people actually want to work for. If you think my relationship with a brilliant analyst is a weakness, you've misunderstood the strength of loyalty. Clara hasn't made me soft, she's made me sharp." From the observation deck, Clara watched through the glass. She saw Julian stand his ground, not through intimidation, but through a new, grounded authority. She realized then that they weren't just two people dating, they were two people reshaping a world. In June, Julian made good on his promise. He chartered a plane, but not for a business trip. They flew to Zurich and then took a long, winding train ride deep into the heart of the Alps. As they stepped off the train in the tiny village of his youth, Julian looked transformed. The designer suit was gone, replaced with a simple sweater and jeans. He looked younger, the lines of tension around his eyes finally smoothing out. "There it is," he said, pointing to the church steeple. It was identical to the one Clara had carved. They walked through the narrow streets, the smell of wood smoke and blooming wildflowers filling the air. Julian led them to a small, weathered cottage with a sign that still faintly read, "Vain Une." "My grandfather used to say that a clock doesn't just tell time, it measures a life," Julian told her as they sat on the porch. I spent 20 years measuring my life in dollars. I want to spend the rest of it measuring it in moments with you. Under the shadow of the peaks, Julian finally asked the question that had been burning in his heart since Christmas. He didn't offer a ring yet, he offered a partnership. "I'm stepping down as CEO," he said, his voice steady. "I'm moving to a chairman role. I want to open a foundation, one that focuses on craftsmanship and vocational arts. And I want you to run the creative direction." Clara looked at the mountains, and then at the man who had become her mountain. "You're giving up the throne for a workshop?" "I'm giving up a cage for a home," Julian said, taking her hands. "I love you, Clara, not because you saved my company, but because you saved me from it." Clara leaned in, kissing him as the sun dipped behind the Alps. "I suppose this means our Secret Santa tradition is officially over," she whispered against his lips. "Actually," Julian laughed, "I think it's just beginning. Every day with you feels like I'm unwrapping something I never thought I'd be allowed to have." Their return to New York wasn't as the boss and the analyst, it was as a force of nature. The office changed, the fear evaporated, replaced by a strange new thing called respect. On their first anniversary of that fateful Secret Santa, Julian walked into Clara's new studio. He watched her for a moment, her hands covered in sawdust, her eyes bright with the joy of creation. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you making?" he asked. "A gift," she said, turning in his arms. "For who?" "For our son," she whispered, placing his hand over her heart. Julian Vane, the man who owned the skyline, finally understood what wealth truly was. It wasn't in the wood, the gold, or the skyscrapers. It was in the heartbeat of the woman who had dared to give him a piece of himself back. The iron vault was gone. In its place stood a man, a house, and a love that was quite literally timeless. News of Julian's transition from CEO to chairman rocked the financial world. The headlines screamed about the end of an era, but inside the walls of Sterling & Co., it felt like a beginning. The cold, metallic scent of the 64th floor began to change. On the first Monday after the announcement, someone brought in a box of actual cinnamon rolls. A small gesture, but in that office, it was a revolution. Julian spent his final days in the glass office, not looking at tickers, but writing a manifesto for his new foundation. He wanted to fund artisans, people like the timber yard owner who had helped Clara. He realized that for 15 years, he had been building a monument to himself, but Clara had taught him how to build a legacy for others. He felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet hum in his chest that no bank balance could ever provide. Clara, too, felt the shift. She was no longer the girl who got lucky. She was the woman who looked into the sun and didn't blink. She spent her afternoons at the new studio site, a repurposed brick warehouse in Brooklyn. She sat on the floor with blueprints and wood samples, feeling the weight of the new responsibility. It wasn't the weight of spreadsheets, it was the weight of dreams. Despite their happiness, the world didn't stop being cruel. The opportunist rumors didn't vanish overnight. Clara received anonymous emails, and the tabloids tried to dig up dirt on her humble upbringing. One evening, she found Julian in his penthouse, his jaw set in that old, familiar line of stone. He was reading a particularly nasty article that suggested Clara had manipulated him for the foundation. "I'll have the publication shut down," Julian growled, his hand tightening around his phone. Clara walked over and gently took the phone from his hand. "No, you won't. If you do that, you're just the iron vault again. Let them talk. They're just confused because they've never seen a man give up power for love. It's a foreign language to them." Julian looked at her, his anger melting into a look of pure adoration. "How are you always the strongest person in the room?" "Because I have nothing to lose," she smiled, "and everything to give." The launch of the Vane Clara Foundation for Craftsmanship was held on a crisp autumn evening. Julian insisted on a small ceremony at the Brooklyn warehouse. There were no black ties, no caviar, and no predatory executives. Instead, there were local artists, students, and the carpenters from the yard. Julian stood on a makeshift stage, looking out at the diverse crowd. He took a small object out of his pocket, the original wooden watch stand. Most people think a company is built on capital, Julian told the crowd, his voice echoing in the rafters. But it's built on time, and time is only valuable if it's spent on things that matter. I spent my life collecting hours like they were coins. My partner, Clara, taught me to spend them like they were seeds. He looked at Clara in the front row. She was glowing, her eyes fixed on him. In that moment, the billion-dollar empire seemed like a footnote. The real story was the man who had found his way home through a block of wood. A year later, the snow returned to Manhattan. It was Christmas Eve again. The office at Sterling & Co. was quiet, most of the staff having gone home early, a new policy Julian had implemented before his departure. Clara and Julian stood in the lobby, looking at the giant tree. It wasn't decorated with gold-plated ornaments this year. It was decorated with small, hand-carved wooden trinkets made by the first class of the foundation's students. "Ready to go?" Julian asked, pulling his coat tighter. "One more thing," Clara said. She reached into her bag and handed him a small, heavy envelope. Julian laughed. "Another Secret Santa? You know I'm not your boss anymore, Clara. You don't have to impress me." "Open it," she insisted. He opened the envelope. Inside were a set of keys and a map. The map was of the village in Zurich, and the keys were to the old Vane Urn cottage. "I bought it back," she whispered. "The foundation is going to restore it as a museum for your grandfather's work. We're going to live there every summer, Julian. We're going to teach our child how to listen to the mountains." Julian pulled her into a hug so tight she could feel his heart beating against hers. The man who could buy the moon had finally received the only thing he ever truly wanted, a future that belonged to him and not his name. The transition to Zurich was a change of scenery. It was a shedding of skins. As the private jet touched down, Julian felt the weight of Manhattan's skyline finally lift from his shoulders. They traveled by train, the click-clack of the rails acting as a metronome for their new, slower life. The Vane Urn cottage was more weathered than Julian remembered. The wood was silvered by decades of mountain sun, and the porch creaked under their weight. But as Clara turned the key in the lock, the air inside smelled exactly the same: oil, ancient dust, and the faint, sweet scent of pine. "It's perfect," Julian whispered, running his hand over his grandfather's old workbench. He looked at his hands, the hands of a billionaire, and felt a sudden, sharp desire to make them useful again. Clara spent the first month documenting every tool and sketch. She worked with the local heritage board to ensure the museum would be a living tribute, not a cold exhibit. Meanwhile, Julian took on the role of a student. He spent his mornings with a local master horologist, learning the delicate art of gears and springs. The man who once moved markets with a single phone call now spent 4 hours trying to place a screw the size of a grain of sand. He had never been happier. While Julian and Clara found peace in the Alps, back in Manhattan, the Vane Clara Foundation was becoming a beacon for a new generation. The Brooklyn warehouse was buzzing with energy. Young women from the Bronx were learning furniture design. Veterans were finding peace in wood turning. Clara managed the foundation through video calls from the cottage, her belly growing rounder with each passing month. She watched through the screen as the first graduates displayed their work. She saw the pride in their eyes, a pride that didn't come from a paycheck, but from the realization that they could create something lasting. However, the old guard of Sterling & Co. wasn't finished. Henderson, the director who had mocked Julian, saw the success of the foundation as a threat to the corporate hierarchy. He launched a campaign in the financial press claiming Julian was squandering the vain legacy on a hobby. Julian read the headlines on the porch of the cottage, the Swiss air cool against his face. A year ago, he would have called his lawyers and buried Henderson in litigation. Now, he simply smiled and handed the tablet to Clara. "He's still measuring life in coins," Julian said. "Let's show him a different currency," Clara replied. In August, the foundation held its first major exhibition in Manhattan. Clara and Julian flew back, the contrast between the mountain air and the city's heat striking them both. The gala wasn't held in a ballroom, it was held in the Brooklyn warehouse itself. The room was filled with the elite of New York, but they were vastly outnumbered by the artisans and their families. At the center of the room sat a single piece of furniture, a massive hand-carved boardroom table made from reclaimed walnut, created by a team of 20 students. Julian stood at the head of the table. "Mr. Henderson," he called out, spotting the director in the crowd. "Come here. Feel the grain of this wood." Henderson approached, looking uncomfortable in his $5,000 suit. He placed a hand on the table. "This table wasn't made by a machine," Julian said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "It was made by people who were told they had no value. It was made with the one thing you think I've squandered: time. This table will be standing long before Sterling & Co. is a footnote in a history book. That is the legacy I am building." The room erupted in applause. Henderson looked down at the wood, his face flushing. For the first time, the iron vault hadn't crushed his opponent. He had simply made him irrelevant. As autumn leaves began to turn the Brooklyn streets gold, Clara went into labor. Julian, the man who had stayed calm during global financial collapses, was a wreck. He paced the hospital waiting room, his fingers tracing the microscopic village on the watchstand he had brought with him. When he was finally called into the room, the world went silent. Clara was exhausted, her hair damp with sweat, but she held a small, swaddled bundle with a look of absolute triumph. "Meet Emile," she whispered. Julian took the tiny boy into his arms. He looked at the miniature fingers, the perfect, fragile life he had helped create. He leaned down and kissed Clara's forehead. "He has your eyes," he whispered. "And he'll have his father's name," Clara said, "but he'll have his great-grandfather's heart." The story of Clara and Julian didn't end with a wedding or a merger. It ended with a new way of living. 5 years later, the 64th floor of Sterling & Co. looked very different. It was no longer a hornet's nest. It was a place where people worked hard but went home at 5 p.m. It was a place where the CEO, now a woman who had been mentored by Clara, knew the names of the janitor's children. In Zurich, the Vane Urn Museum was a world-renowned destination, but on summer evenings after the tourists had left, the cottage was just a home. Julian sat at the workbench, a pair of magnifying goggles on his head. Beside him sat a 5-year-old Emile, holding a small, blunt carving tool and a piece of scrap wood. "Easy, Emile," Julian said, warm and patient. "Don't fight the wood. Listen to it. It'll tell you where it wants to break." Clara stood in the doorway, a cup of tea in her hands, watching the 2 men in her life. She looked at the watchstand on the shelf, the one made of butcher paper and twine dreams, and she smiled. She had set out to make an impression on a man who had everything. She ended up giving him the one thing he didn't know he was missing, a reason to let the clock run out, knowing that every second was exactly where it was meant to be. The Secret Santa of Sterling & Co. was no longer a secret. It was a legend, a reminder that in the coldest of winters, the warmest gifts are the ones we carve out of our own hearts. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories that inspire, teach, and entertain. Until next time, bye!